So this program, it really was it was spurred by the stock and flock that Nikki gave some time ago. There's a bunch of us on the call that as we started hearing about the surveys that Nikki had done with her colleagues across the nation, for those of us that had 4-H assignments, we started wondering, well, we know that there's a public need for education, and maybe youth is where we can start that in Utah. So we got a very large team, a pretty good sized team of us from throughout the state, folks from a lot of different backgrounds. So we had some specialists there on our team, as well as county faculty that have natural resources and 4-H kind of specialties. We were able to apply for an extension grant, which has actually funded the program for 2 years. And we were grateful to see that. So yeah, there's some cool things happening coming from these stock and flocks. So kind of the purpose, I think all of us here would recognize that there's some issues with wild horse management. So throughout the presentation, if I use WHBs, so wild horse and burros or free roaming horse and burros, it's all kind of the same thing. So don't get caught up if I say WHBs. But 1971, we had the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burro Act. So that was a congressional act that basically protected horses where they had not had an amount of protection before. They are not native wildlife. That's meant that there are some capacities for management, such as euthanization or selling them off. There was some time there that these were being captured in quantities and being sold. Well, that was no longer allowed under this act. So BLM in particular, they were tasked with the determined appropriate management level for them is 26,000, a little over 26,000 wild horses and burros. Currently in the US, we have about 95,000. And that's just the ones we know that are on federal public lands. There could be we don't have a very good estimate for what's even out there on sovereign lands, indigenous lands. There's likely a lot in some of those areas as well that aren't included in this. But even with what we know, we're projected to hit 160,000 by 2025. So it's an issue, and obviously these are heritage icons. People love horses. I love horses, but there's a lot of interesting ideas out there about wild horse management. So for those that didn't see Nikki's talk, Dr. Fry's talk, about 35% of people in her national survey, over 3,000 participants, indicated that equids, free roaming horses and burros, were non-native, and that was less than 10% in Utah and Nevada. Of course, we know that horses were brought here by European colonists. And only about 18% of Western participants could actually correctly identify that WHBs were in their state. Which, as we know, for public lands, the only Western state that doesn't have any is Washington. I believe that there are WHBs on sovereign lands there, but yeah, this is pretty concerning because all of these Western states have them in their state, and people just don't know. And the overwhelming majority of participants in this study indicated that when it comes to management, we should be letting nature take its course. There's a very hands-off idea that we should let WHBs do what they do out in nature, and let them be free and majestic and grandiose, like the picture here, which has obviously been in conflict with what we know from data. We know that we need to have some action in place, some sort of management protocols for public lands managers. So our objective for our Mustang camp was to increase awareness. Sorry about the double typo there. So increasing the overall awareness of free roaming horses and their management, the issues that we're trying to tackle in these states through developing curriculum and resources. We also wanted to provide integrated, multifaceted, hands-on youth education. So Mustang camps, really getting kids out in the field, showing them what's happening out in the surroundings, and reintegrating that back to overall agriculture, natural resources, STEM, all these sort of very cross-disciplinary approaches, and really a third kind of objective of ours is to have these youth not only gain subject knowledge, but to translate that to potential career pathways. So our pilot program, we did a 2-day program last year. I should have put a map in here. It was 2-day program. We started in Tooele, did some in-class sort of stuff, basically wound our way on dirt back roads all the way down to Delta, looking at WHB management areas, checking out some wild horses, doing field day work, staying the night in Delta, getting up, going out to the Conjure herd in the morning, and then coming back. We covered a lot of ground with this, and throughout the entire program, our approach was really, here's the data. In 4-H, we tend to think about it as we don't tell kids how to think, or we don't tell kids what to think when it comes to kind of the public relations issue side of things, but we can teach them how to think. So we give them the data, let them use those critical thinking skills to kind of come up with their own thoughts and opinions once they know what the data actually is. So obviously, as a very complex issue. There's a lot of different intersections of topics. So we covered areas, subject areas in range science, natural resources, equine animal science, as well as agriculture, which of course are all kind of subsets of STEM in our field-based camp here. And our goal, we didn't just want to pull youth from, for those that aren't familiar with 4-H, 4-H does have a very large equine horse program, and we didn't just want to target those kids. We had a very broad approach to advertising and recruitment, and we got kids all throughout Utah to come to our camp. So the first day we started into it. We gave some evaluations out. We did a pre and post evaluation looking at not only their retention of the material, the subject material, the facts, as it were, but our post objectives. Well, we did have some pre-evaluations that also were measuring their thoughts, opinions about those issues that are up to them to make up their mind. So we had some in classroom portions where we talked about range science. So how do range plants grow? How are they managed? What happens if you increase or decrease the amount of horses on an area? What happens to the plants? What happens to the rangeland ecology? What happens to the horses overall? I think we talked about wild horse ecology in one breakout section. So modeling population dynamics with horses and showing the kids how quickly horse populations can increase, and how not only carrying capacity effects, but stochastic effects on populations can increase overall herd health. We also talked about equine science, so talking about what are the things about a horse that make them fundamentally different than, say, a native animal, a bison, a deer, an antelope out there grazing. You know, their digestive tract is different than our native animals. Their mode of getting food is very different. Their hooves are very different. So talking about all of those differences and the impacts that has on a system that has not evolved for carrying horses, in particular with the population levels we're seeing a lot of times. So after our kind of in classroom portion, we got to go speak to some producers. This is a producer out in Clover, Utah. So in Tooele County. This is just down the road from the Anarchy herd, which is a very contentious herd in Utah. It's very close to population centers. It's very highly visible. There's a lot of people with eyes on this Anarchy herd in Utah. And this producer, he told us he's a multi-generational rancher, and he got to explain to us what his familial generation familiarity was with that herd. He told us about how you know, at one point there was a herd, and if you were riding around and you saw a really nice looking mare that was out in that herd, you would corral it, you'd rope it, and you'd take it home. It was yours. They were just horses that were interbreeding with horses coming off farms, sometimes escapees, sometimes purposely let loose for whatever reason. And they were somewhat managed by the people there. They were using them as a resource. So we talked about, how that dynamic has changed under protection. And he also talked about how the impacts that he's seen on the land is those herd numbers have increased. It was a really cool way, I think, for us to show kids that rangeland management it's not just animals out on range looking at plants, which is easy to show, but looking at the human dimension of those impacts. How does it impact the people in those areas? How does it impact public lands grazers? How does it impact the land that belongs to all of us? So that was a really cool thing that we got to do with the kids. Before I forget, we had 21 kids that came with us, 21 youth on this camp. We did limit it to intermediate and senior aged youth, just due to the fact of what we were doing. So after that, we got to go check out the Aniki herd. Hauled everyone out to the rangeland, set up spotting scopes, had binoculars there that we got to check out wild horses. This part was a lot of fun. And we were actually able to get pretty close. For those that remember, last summer, it was an exceptionally dry, droughty year. So it was not hard to find horses. Basically, all we had to do is find where there was water, and that's exactly where horses are. Also, the Aniki herd, where we were going through, they see a lot of traffic, a lot of photographers and tourists and who knows coming through to check them out. It's not a secret by any means. One of the managers that we talked to actually talked about how they would lure horses in by shaking Dorito bags, because they had become accustomed to being hand-fed and such. So they were pretty easy to approach. We were able to get pretty close to having those kids take a look at them. You can see here, one of our vehicles was able to get pretty close. So it was a really interesting to be able to see the condition of the vegetation around the sacrificial areas where you have a water source. Because of the drought, we even got to see some competition with native wildlife. There's a buck pronghorn that came in and circled probably about 15-20 times trying to get to that drinker, and every single time the horses chased him off, they would start circling and kind of putting on their defenses. And then so that buck would take off, but eventually thirst got a hold of him, and he would start circling back. Interestingly enough, when we were we actually went and checked out that water, that guzzler, and there was no water in it actually. There was a couple drips and some wet sand in the bottom basically, and that was about it. But because of the range conditions at that time last year, those horses were still holding tight. We were lucky enough that a local program, local news access program, County Highlights, actually came out and filmed us. They documented our trip through Utah, and took some great video of us out there educating youth on wild horse issues. We also did some in the field rangeland science. So we took hoops and collected forage and weighed it out to try to calculate appropriate management levels given what forage was there. This is a technique that is widely used in rangeland management. So we were actually able to replicate that and give youth a hands-on experience on how to do that and calculate potential head densities for the areas we were going through. Kailyn Taylor, who is hopefully on the call and can hopefully help with questions afterwards. He's faculty in Millard County. He has actually adopted some WHBs, some wild donkeys from the BLM at auction. So we had on the second day we had we got to have breakfast, get up, and go check out some donkeys that Kailyn has been training for a really up close and personal experience with WHBs. In Delta, we were able to visit the federal holding facility. The manager there was awesome to work with us. We were afraid we may not be able to get in there at that time. They had just done a roundup of, if I recall correctly, about 300 horses were rounded up not very long before we got there. So the timing did work out for us, but we did have to be a little bit careful with our media presence and stuff from being there at that time. But the BLM was super awesome to work with, and we got to see horses that have been in that facility for some time, ones that have just come off range. There was a pen of colts with mares that everyone was very enamored with. This was one of the favorites for a lot of the youth. They told us that this is one of their favorite parts of being out there. And the manager did an exceptional job at explaining kind of the management side of it. So not just the public perception issue, but the management issues behind wild horse management. We also had a county commissioner come out and talk about her experience with wild horse management. She's worked for quite a while with the Freeze group which is, I can't remember what the acronym is off the top of my head, but it's a network for people working on wild horse, appropriate wild horse management. Lots of cool pictures for you guys. We also got to go to the Conjure Herd, which is outside, which is Millard County, quite a drive away from Delta. You're but a stone's throw away from Nevada at this point by the time we get there. So we did get to go out there as well, do some on the ground data collection, and talk about the issues that we're seeing out there as well. So it was an amazing program. I just wanted to show you guys some cool pictures for storytelling. I also kind of wanted to show you guys some of the data that we collected from our evaluations. So when we asked kids what their primary project areas were, you know, we had a very, like I said before, we had a very broad reach for advertising and recruitment. We did have a fair amount of kids that were from the livestock, horse, ag kind of group, but we had a lot of kids from leadership, fine arts, kind of the FCS group, STEM, that actually had no prior knowledge really of horses. Sometimes a surprisingly low knowledge of horses. So in our pre-survey, we asked them if they had ever seen WHBs before. So the vast majority, pretty good majority, said no, they hadn't. A few didn't really know. About a third of them said that they had. Now I think this is an interesting graph. So this is the same data. We actually asked them if they had seen WHBs in their post-assessment. You'll notice that most of them had decided that they had seen them. There's a few that decided they hadn't seen them. So I don't know what they were doing for 2 days. But also there was some that weren't really sure what they had seen. I just think this is kind of a funny graph and a reminder that we are dealing with sample size of 21 kids. So these are all very descriptive, but they paint a broad picture of what we're seeing as far as our impact with this program. So as I said, all Western states except for Washington have public lands occupied by free roaming horses. So when we asked pre versus post to tell us what states had them, we did notice a slight decrease in their incorrect indication that Washington state had them. We saw a slight decrease in the correct identification that Utah had them. At this point, I think there may have been just a wild horse denier in the group, because we most certainly did see them. And yeah, we didn't have anybody quite nail that question. But we did see a good increase in the number of kids that could correctly identify that horses were not native to North America. At least modern horses, they were introduced by explorers and came from Europe. So when we talked about predators, there's a large knowledge gap when it comes to predation, natural predation on horses. Truth is, there is not really a predator that is native to North America that is a very good predator for horses. They just have not evolved with such a big animal that does the things the horses do. So pre-test, we had a wide variety of youth believing that different things ate horses. Post, most kids had figured out that there really are no natural predators outside from a rare loss by cougars, maybe. There's no real common predator, which of course leads to less natural regulation of WHB populations. I'm not going to. I just kind of pulled out some of the graphs and data impacts that I thought were interesting. We had quite a bit of data, but I didn't have time to cover all of it. So when we exceed the appropriate management level, which is basically carrying capacity, or the below carrying capacity target for management for WHBs, we asked the kids what they thought would happen. We did see more kids indicate that yeah, those horses are negatively impacted. They aren't going to have enough food, and potentially you're looking at death for some of those. So this was another interesting one. So as I had mentioned, we actually got to see negative impacts on wildlife, and this is still one of our. We gave you a fact, identify the correct outcome, but it's almost starting, if you were of the persuasion, to get back to opinion. But we got to see negative impacts of native wildlife on pronghorn antelope from WHBs, and we did see an increase in the number of kids that agreed with that statement. Now, an interesting one, when we asked them about domestic animals, so public land grazing animals, cattle, sheep, livestock, we didn't get quite the same result, and maybe that's because we didn't get to see it. You know, we didn't really see cows. We didn't really see cows or sheep out on the range, but we saw more youth indicating a disagreement, and a slight decrease in agreement rate for this. Again, is just a reminder, we're dealing with pretty low sample sizes, 21 kids. So when we asked them about the should management be hands-off, is this a situation where nature should be allowed to take its course and humans should be a bystander? We actually saw an increase, 67% increase in disagreement. So meaning that some sort of management intervention should be made, versus versus a negative, negative increase is not correct. As you can see here, there was a strong decrease in agreement. So kind of approaching something that is maybe more couched in science and what we maybe need for managers. Again, these opinion questions aren't something that we said, you have to believe that this is the path. Our idea was you give them the data, you show them the impacts, and let them make up their mind. We also asked a few more broad-reaching questions. So one example was the science, is it the tool that we should be using to solve environmental problems? We did see a small increase in agreement, but we also saw a larger increase in disagreement. How that happens, I don't know. A few of these questions, as we've talked about them, I think there's some broader need for maybe some digging in deeper to some of the proximal causes for some of those outcomes that we saw. But again, we're dealing with one group of kids, an N of 1, and only 21 kids at that for evaluation. And this was an interesting one. So as we talked to them about horse impacts on land, and how does that affect everyone? Not just, this isn't something that's just something about plants. We had producers there, managers there, talking about the economic impacts of overpopulation of WHBs. So we, when we asked them about that issue, we actually did see an increase in agreement that public lands are an important part of the U.S. economy. So we also asked a series of questions coming back to that, career pathway. We recruited from a wide variety of youth, from STEM kids to FCS kids that do FCS, to fine arts, photography, lots of different things. And so kind of what we want to know is, if you take this pool of youth and get them into an immersive program like this, does it increase their interest in a career in natural resources management? Again, we're dealing with low sample sizes, but I thought it was kind of interesting that we dropped a little bit for agreement, a negligible decrease in agreement, given our sample size. And also maybe we changed some minds. There's a little increase in disagreement. But as you guys saw before in the first graph, some kids didn't even think that they saw wild horses. So I don't know if these are very good. With the sample size, we need some more data. We also followed, one of the other follow-ups to this was an increase in STEM. We basically saw a similar trend. So I don't think at this point we can say that this program is getting kids to change their career trajectory completely. But this is a pilot, and we have plenty of more data to collect. So what did we learn? And I'd like to make sure to give some time to Kailyn if he has some other thoughts and ideas and answer some questions. But overall, this was an awesome experience. Getting to take kids out there and show them an environment that some of them have never really seen, and dealing with an issue that maybe they had no idea was going on. We got really positive feedback overall. All of our cooperators had very good feedback. I think so. I only showed you a few of the kind of facts assessment, but overall, we kind of increased. We gained a better knowledge. Of course, we didn't capture that knowledge gain for everyone, but as we talked about at post program, one thing we're trying to do is in our next go around with this is maybe reinforcing some of the material. There's a lot of windshield time in this. If you can imagine driving from Tooele to Delta and stopping, making some stops on some dirt roads to talk about different things. A lot of windshield time, and probably time that we can use to help reinforce what they learned in those rotation sessions on day number 1. And then, of course, we probably have some tweaks to evaluation to really get an idea on the impacts of this. But overall, it was a really cool program. So evaluating these sort of programs for youth is difficult. We tried to capture some, the qualitative or quantitative data that we could, but there's a world of quantitative out there, quantitative impacts that were pretty interesting to see. So this youth here pictured, he's from like downtown Salt Lake City, had never been out on range. One of them had never used an outhouse before. This particular kid, as you can see in the midground of this picture, these are stallion piles. So the stallions will use those dung piles around their territory to kind of scent mark their area. This youth didn't really know what that was, what these strange rocks were, and he was blown away when we rolled up to see these horses. He was asking us, "Whoa, what are those? Are those moose? Are those deer?" I'm like, "No, those are horses." "Well, they're so big." "Yeah, they're horses. They're big." So just some really cool experiences for these youth, and we could talk about some of those all day, but I guess so. Kind of thinking about what's our next step in this. We got a pilot program under our belt. So part of what we're doing is developing some curriculum, so that can be distributed to people to run their own Mustang camps, whether it's tooling around the hills like we did, or maybe more classroom-based experiences to get an idea of what's going on. We're working on that. Kailyn Taylor, who was our the presenter for this project, at the regional meeting for the National Association of County Agricultural Agents, was able to have a presentation in Colorado for agriculture NR agents throughout the Western US. Not surprisingly, there was a lot of people from other Western states that were blown away by this program. They want our materials. They want to figure out how to do something similar. So pretty good run, I think, for a pilot. We still want to diversify our participants. As we've talked about it, can we take some of the questions here that we're dealing with and use WHB education as a vehicle to diversify options for participants. For instance, one of the youth that he was super involved in STEM. He's a robotics. That's his 4-H go-to is robotics and maker sort of projects. Had never been out in the field like this. And while we're out there, he kept picking weeds and bring them to us. And, well, what kind of plant is this? What kind of plant is this? And what does it do? And asking questions about the bugs and the horses and all these sorts of things. And it was just really cool to see them starting to connect, like, yeah, this Rangeland Science is science. Science isn't, there's science everywhere. And there's scientific implication to what's going on that you're seeing on the ground. And then, of course, we've also talked about adult education. Can we do something similar for adults in order to increase public knowledge of WHB populations and management issues? And we have set our times for the second round of Mustang camps. So we're actually offering 2 different weeks. Registration isn't open yet. This is the save the date. If anyone needs any of that information on the call here to get out to your counties, please let us know, and we'll be more than happy to supply that. And that's it. I'm going to just stop share here.
Well, thank you. I put a couple of questions that came to my mind in the chat. Before we get to a few questions here, I also want to highlight that a few links on some reference papers were put in here by Terry and group. So make sure when this is going to go away as soon as we end our Zoom. So if you're interested in those reference links, then get back on the chat and get those so that you'll have that information. And thank you, Terry, for putting that in there. So I think the question about what the location was handled here, I had a question about sort of your methodology on the testing questions or assessment questions.
Yeah.
And there was youth expertise on the team. I saw that. There's quite a bit. What sort of process did you go through on the questions just to make sure that they were effective questions, right? So the youth understood them, and when you use certain words, there may be a leveling gap that's there, understanding. So tell me, describe that for us.
Yeah, for sure. So we started by essentially collecting questions. We knew that we had the specific rotations that we wanted to integrate into our program. So we collected questions, the knowledge sort of questions for assessment. We collected those from the individuals to put together, and then we went through kind of a reiterative process to refine those. And yeah, it's sometimes hard to make those data type questions, knowledge test type questions, to where there's no, or try to reduce the amount of misunderstanding for the question or the answer. So it took us a large amount of time in being able to do that. And overall, so I showed you a few, but I think overall we had something like 38 questions. The knowledge questions worked pretty good. We considering we had kids that were, being driven across Utah that maybe didn't want to sit and fill out an evaluation post. Those work pretty good. The ones that I think are more interesting are those interpretive opinion questions. And I think a lot of those, I think some of those could be refined a little bit. Work we'd like to work with Lindell, Noreen, before our next go at this, to see if maybe he has some suggestions. But yeah, the data didn't always fall out quite where we thought it would. But it's making sure those words that are being used are defined in presentations, and we're having a common use of those words was definitely a hard thing to do for our evaluation